Julia Matthews had planned every detail of her wedding down to perfection. The golden autumn leaves, the crisp mountain air, and the breathtaking aisle that wound through the Blue Ridge forest. But what she hadn't planned for was the uninvited guest that brought her procession to a sudden halt. Gasps rippled through the guests as a sleek, tawny figure stepped onto the stone path. A wild bobcat, standing tall and unafraid. Time seemed to freeze as the animal locked eyes with Julia. And in that moment, everything changed. Because this wasn't just a chance encounter. The bobcat hadn't come to disrupt the ceremony. It had come with a purpose. What unfolded next would reveal a heartbreaking truth hidden within the heart of the forest, turning Julia's wedding day into something far more unforgettable than she had ever imagined.
Julia Matthews had always dreamed of an outdoor wedding. Growing up in the rolling hills of western North Carolina, she'd spent countless hours imagining herself walking down a natural aisle, surrounded by the pristine beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, at 28, that dream was finally becoming reality at the picturesque Mountain Laurel Wedding Estate, a venue nestled in the heart of the Appalachians. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and crisp, with early October painting the surrounding forest in brilliant shades of amber and gold. Julia stood before the mirror in the bride's cottage, her hands trembling slightly as her mother, Sarah, adjusted the delicate lace veil. The dress, an elegant A-line gown with subtle floral embroidery, had been carefully chosen to complement the natural setting. "You look perfect, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "Your father would have been so proud." Julia's throat tightened at the mention of her father, who had passed away 2 years ago after a brief but fierce battle with pancreatic cancer. His absence on this day left an ache in her heart that even the joy of marrying Michael couldn't completely fill. "I know, Mom," she managed, squeezing her mother's hand. "I can feel him here with us." Outside, 90 guests had gathered in white chairs arranged in neat rows along a stone pathway. The aisle stretched between them, covered in scattered rose petals that somehow managed to stay in place despite the gentle mountain breeze. At the end stood an arch decorated with native wildflowers and greenery, under which Michael waited with the officiant, looking handsome and slightly nervous in his charcoal gray suit. The wedding coordinator, Lisa, poked her head into the cottage. "It's time," she announced with a warm smile. "Are you ready?" Julia took a deep breath and nodded. Her brother David, who would be walking her down the aisle in their father's place, offered his arm with a reassuring smile. "Let's do this, sis." The small wedding party assembled at the beginning of the stone path. First went the flower girl, Michael's 5-year-old niece Emma, scattering fresh petals atop the ones already in place. Then came the bridesmaids in their sage green dresses, followed by Julia's best friend and maid of honor, Rachel. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon in D, and Julia's heart swelled with emotion. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. David squeezed her arm gently, and they took their first step forward. That's when it happened. A tawny form emerged from the surrounding woodland with fluid grace, padding silently onto the stone path about halfway to the altar. The bobcat was larger than Julia had expected, standing about twice the size of a house cat, with distinctive black-tipped ears and powerful shoulders. Time seemed to freeze as guests gasped and murmured, some half rising from their seats in alarm. Julia's first instinct was fear, but something about the wild cat's demeanor gave her pause. It wasn't acting aggressively. Rather, it seemed alert and focused, its attention fixed on something near the flower-decorated arch. Then she saw it, a copperhead snake, its distinctive hourglass patterns visible even from a distance, slithering from beneath the decorative greenery directly toward where Michael stood. The venomous serpent, likely disturbed by the wedding preparations and confused by the crowd, was headed straight for her soon-to-be husband. Before anyone could react, the bobcat moved with lightning speed. In 3 fluid bounds, it positioned itself between the snake and the wedding party. The copperhead froze, then quickly changed direction, retreating into the underbrush as the bobcat maintained its protective stance. For a long moment, nobody moved. The bobcat remained still, its muscles tensed as it surveyed the area for any remaining threat. Then, with the same silent grace with which it had appeared, the wild cat turned and padded back into the forest, leaving behind a stunned wedding party and guests. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the crowd, followed by excited whispers and nervous laughter. Michael, who had been ready to leap away from the snake, looked both relieved and amazed. The officiant, a local minister who had lived in the mountains his whole life, smiled knowingly. "Well," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet gathering, "I believe we've just witnessed something truly remarkable. Shall we continue?" Julia felt David's arm trembling slightly against hers, but when she looked up at her brother, he was smiling. "Dad always said these mountains had their own kind of magic," he whispered. "Ready to finish this walk?" With tears of relief and wonder in her eyes, Julia nodded. The quartet resumed playing, and this time, their walk down the aisle was completed without interruption. When she reached Michael and took his hands in hers, they shared a look of profound gratitude for their unexpected guardian. The ceremony proceeded beautifully, with the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the proceedings. During the exchange of vows, Julia couldn't help but glance occasionally toward the tree line, wondering about their mysterious protector. The bobcat's intervention felt like more than mere coincidence. It felt like a blessing from the mountains themselves. During the reception, held in an elegantly decorated tent nearby, the bobcat incident became the talk of the evening. Several guests had managed to capture photos and videos on their phones, and Julia was amazed to see just how close the wild cat had come. In the images, its features were clear. A mature female bobcat with intelligent eyes and a distinctive white patch on her left ear. "That's Old Grace," one of the venue's groundskeepers mentioned when he saw them reviewing the photos. "She's been around these parts for years. Never caused any trouble, but we've never seen her get this close to people before either." "Old Grace?" Julia asked, intrigued. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named Tom who had worked the property for over 2 decades, nodded. "That's what we call her. She showed up about 5 years ago, already full-grown. Must have lost her original territory somewhere else and settled here. She's good to have around. Keeps the rabbit and rodent population in check, which means fewer snakes coming around looking for food." This information fascinated Julia, and as she and Michael settled into their new home, a charming cottage just a mile from the wedding venue, she found herself thinking often about the bobcat that had made their wedding day even more memorable than they'd planned. A week after returning from their honeymoon, Julia was tending to the small garden she'd started when she spotted a familiar form at the edge of their property. Old Grace sat regally at the tree line, her tawny coat glowing in the morning sun. Their eyes met, and Julia felt that same connection she'd experienced on her wedding day, a sense of mutual respect and understanding. Careful not to make any sudden movements, Julia slowly retreated into the house and returned with a small piece of chicken from their refrigerator. She placed it on a plate and set it at the edge of the yard, then backed away. The bobcat watched her movements with interest but didn't approach until Julia had returned to her gardening, deliberately turning her back to show she meant no threat. From the corner of her eye, she saw Old Grace approach the plate with typical feline caution, sniff the offering, and delicately consume it. When finished, the bobcat sat for a moment, grooming her face, before disappearing back into the forest. This became something of a ritual between them. Every few days, Old Grace would appear while Julia worked in the garden, and Julia would leave a small offering of food. She was careful not to make it a daily occurrence, understanding the importance of not making the wild animal dependent on human handouts. Instead, it became a gesture of mutual respect and gratitude. Michael, though initially concerned about encouraging a wild predator to visit their property, came to share Julia's fascination with their unusual neighbor. He even set up a motion-activated wildlife camera near the edge of their property, capturing fascinating glimpses into Old Grace's life. Through these observations, they learned that she had a den in a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile from their home. They also discovered, to their delight, that she wasn't alone. The camera captured images of two young kits playing near the den entrance while their mother watched vigilantly. No wonder she was so protective at the wedding, Julia realized one evening as they reviewed the footage. She had babies to think about. Their connection with Old Grace deepened that spring when one of her kits suffered an injury. Julia first noticed something was wrong when the Bobcat appeared at the edge of their property in the middle of the day, something she never usually did. Her behavior was different too, more agitated, more vocal. Following a hunch, Julia and Michael carefully tracked Old Grace back to her den, maintaining a respectful distance. There they found one of the kits lying listlessly near the entrance, its rear leg badly swollen. "It looks like a snake bite," Michael observed, using the zoom lens on their camera to get a better look. "Should we call someone?" Julia was already dialing the number for Carol Henderson, a local wildlife rehabilitator she'd researched and saved in her contacts months ago, just in case. Carol arrived within the hour, equipped with the necessary tools and expertise to help. To everyone's amazement, Old Grace allowed them to approach and treat her kit, though she watched every movement with intense focus. The young Bobcat had indeed been bitten by a copperhead. An ironic twist given their first encounter, but Carol was able to administer the necessary treatment. "This is extraordinary," Carol commented as she worked. "I've never seen a wild bobcat display this level of trust with humans. You've built something special here." Over the next few weeks, Julia and Michael helped Carol monitor the kit's recovery, providing supplemental food and water to ensure the young family had everything they needed. The experience only strengthened their bond with Old Grace, who seemed to understand that they had helped save her baby. As the years passed, their unusual friendship continued to evolve. Old Grace remained a constant presence in their lives, though always maintaining her wild nature. She had several more litters of kits, each generation adding to the local bobcat population while helping to maintain the delicate balance of the mountain ecosystem. The bobcat's protective instincts extended beyond that first wedding day intervention. There were numerous occasions when her presence deterred potentially dangerous wildlife from approaching the house. She seemed particularly vigilant whenever Julia and Michael's own family began to grow. When their first child, a daughter they named Grace in honor of their feline friend, was born, Old Grace appeared to take special interest in the new addition to their family. She would often be spotted watching from a distance when they took the baby outside, her protective nature extending to this tiny human who shared her name. The story of the wedding day bobcat became something of a local legend, shared and reshared throughout the mountain community. It sparked a greater interest in wildlife conservation in the area, with Julia and Michael becoming advocates for responsible coexistence with wild animals. They worked with Carol to establish a local wildlife education program, using their unique experience to help others understand and appreciate the importance of respecting and protecting native species. 5 years after their wedding, Julia stood in their backyard, watching their daughter playing safely within the fenced area while Old Grace lounged in her usual spot at the forest's edge. The bobcat's coat had begun to show signs of age, with gray hairs sprinkled around her muzzle, but her eyes were as alert and intelligent as ever. "You know," Michael said, joining his wife and wrapping an arm around her waist, "when people talk about spirit animals, I used to think it was just a nice idea. But Old Grace, she's something special." Julia nodded, leaning into his embrace. "She taught me something important that day at our wedding, and every day since." that sometimes the most meaningful connections come in the most unexpected forms. We think we understand the boundaries between wild and tame, between nature and civilization, but maybe those lines aren't as clear as we believe. As if in response to their conversation, Old Grace stood and stretched, her movements still graceful despite her advancing years. She gave them one last look that seemed to hold all the wisdom and mystery of the mountains themselves, before melting away into the forest shadows. That evening, as Julia put their daughter to bed, the little girl asked for her favorite story, the tale of how a brave bobcat had blessed her parents' wedding day. As Julia recounted the events once again, she felt overwhelming gratitude for the unique gift they'd been given. Not just protection on that crucial day, but an ongoing reminder of the profound connections possible between all living beings. Outside, as the mountain night settled in, a familiar silhouette moved through the darkness, ever watchful, ever present. A guardian spirit in fur and flesh, bridging the gap between wild and tame, reminding all who knew her story that love and trust can transcend the boundaries we humans so often create. In the years that followed, Old Grace became more than just a local legend. She became a symbol of the delicate balance between human development and wildlife conservation. Her story was featured in national wildlife magazines and nature documentaries, inspiring similar initiatives across the country to promote peaceful coexistence between humans and wild animals. Julia and Michael continued to expand their family, eventually welcoming a son they named David, after Julia's brother. Throughout it all, Old Grace remained a constant presence, though she gradually spent more time observing from afar as age slowed her movements. Her own family line continued to thrive in the area, with several of her descendants establishing territories nearby, maintaining the beneficial relationship she had pioneered with the human inhabitants. When Old Grace finally passed away, peaceful and dignified in her familiar den during her 15th winter, Julia and Michael mourned her as they would a family member. With Carol's help, they established the Old Grace Wildlife Sanctuary, a protected area of land surrounding their property where animals could find safe haven and humans could learn about responsible wildlife interaction. The sanctuary became a living testament to an extraordinary friendship that began with a moment of crisis on a wedding day and blossomed into something far more meaningful, a bridge between two worlds that most people believe cannot coexist. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful guardians come in unexpected forms, and that love, trust, and respect can transcend the boundaries of species. Today, visitors to the Mountain Laurel Wedding Estate often report seeing a bobcat with a distinctive white patch on its ear watching over their ceremonies from the tree line. Whether it's one of Old Grace's descendants or simply her spirit keeping watch over the place where her legend began, no one can say for certain. But every time Julia visits the sanctuary and sees a bobcat in the distance, she feels that same connection she experienced on her wedding day, a reminder that some bonds, once formed, become part of the very fabric of the mountains themselves. And when people ask her about the bobcat that blessed her wedding, Julia always tells them the same thing. Sometimes the greatest gifts come not from what we plan, but from what nature, in its infinite wisdom, chooses to share with us. In the end, Old Grace gave them far more than protection from a snake. She gave them a new way of seeing the world, where the line between wild and tame blurs, and where love knows no boundaries. As the sun sets behind the Blue Ridge Mountains each evening, casting long shadows across the sanctuary that bears her name, Old Grace's legacy lives on in the hearts of all who knew her and in the continuing harmony between the human and wild residents of these ancient hills. Her story serves as a testament to the extraordinary possibilities that exist when we open our hearts to unexpected connections and learn to see the world through eyes unclouded by conventional boundaries. In the end, what began as a startling interruption to a wedding ceremony became a profound lesson in trust, respect, and the enduring power of unconditional love. a lesson that continues to touch hearts and change lives, one story at a time.